debate, I should just like to point out that the question time will last for about 60 minutes. There will be 1 minute to ask a question, 2 minutes for the reply, and 30 seconds for a supplementary question, and 2 minutes for that reply. I should like to remind you that a possible supplementary question is only granted if it is closely related to the main question and does not comprise a new question. If you want to ask a question, I should like to invite you to register that request now by using the Catch the Eye function on your voting machine after you have put in your voting card. During question time, interventions should take place from your seat. And I should like to invite all speakers, please, to stick to the allocated speaking time. Colleagues might need a few moments to register their request to ask a question through their voting machine. So once again, I should like to ask you to put in your request now, and we shall start with the first question. And I have here Mr. Koupilius from the EPP. You have the floor, Mr. Koupilius.
Well, thanks a lot, Mr. Vice President. Dear colleagues, really, first of all, we can be quite happy with recent developments on military front in Ukraine. That's really, we can congratulate Ukrainian soldiers and leadership. And of course, they're doing that great job because the West is providing weapons. But my questions would be about, about the future, and not about the military future. Really, things in Ukraine are very, very much damaged by Russian occupants and so on. Economy is, in a bad shape. We know from IMF evaluations that each month Ukraine needs around from 5 to 7 billion external financial assistance. And my question would be for next year, what Commission is planning, because it means that for next year we need to have around 70 billion, external assistance for Ukraine.
Danke.
Thank you very much. The High Representative, Mr. Borrell.
Well, indeed, the future cannot just be looked at from a military vantage point, because sooner or later the war will come to an end and Ukraine will have to be rebuilt. But as it is, we have to keep it alive economically. And this is why the President took the initiative of proposing microfinancial assistance to Ukraine, rising to 9 billion euros. Some have already been made available. Member states have agreed that 5 will be made available soon. 3 will come later, depending on the agreement reached by the member states in that connection. So in the end, we would have made available these $9 billion worth of financial assistance.
Very short,
Bardzo krótki komentarz, czy może nawet pytanie dodatkowe. Tak, winszujemy Komisji za to, że znalazło sposób na to, żeby przygotować się na 9 miliardów. Ale moje pytanie dotyczy przyszłego roku. 70 miliardów będzie trzeba, żeby po prostu zapewnić takie codzienne funkcjonowanie rządu w Ukrainie. opłaty dla lekarzy, dla nauczycieli. Także ja zapytam się Komisji, czy jest jakiś taki plan długoterminowy na dofinansowanie rządu, czy można wygrać tę wojnę nie tylko militarnie, ale również na podstawie konkretnej pomocy.
Borrell.
Dziękuję. Pan Borrell, proszę bardzo.
Sin duda.
There can be no doubt, indeed, that a lot more must be done. But that's what international financial institutions are there for, and not just the European Union. Ukraine is negotiating with the International Monetary Fund for financial assistance to give it some macroeconomic sustainability. It's not the European Union with our budget, which, as you know, it is what it is and had been adopted prior to the Ukrainian war. So we cannot replace the Ukrainian state in providing for all public services in that country. And this is what I was saying earlier, that we have decided to make assistance available to the tune of 9 billion. So far, only 1 has been made available. 8 will be coming soon. And Ukraine, in the meantime, is negotiated with the IMF for microfinancial assistance that is higher. Because obviously, with the figures I have given you, we won't be able to solve all of the problems facing Ukraine. But keeping Ukrainian economically alive is absolutely vital. And this is what we're doing now. So apart from this 9 billion, there is 1,200,000 that had already been adopted before the president went ahead with this further assistance. Now, the Ukrainian government is obviously not happy with the way the IMF is handling their request, not sufficiently fast in their view, but we must continue making sure that it is done as quickly as possible. Thank you. Mr. Maria Reina.
Monsieur le Haut Représentant,
Mr. High Representative, 3 questions. First of all, Ukrainian children. They're particularly vulnerable today. Some of them have, in fact, even been kidnapped and have been abused. Do we have any specific service to look after them? Second, crimes against aggression. We know that there was a request put in by the ad hoc tribunal. What are the brakes on the action of this tribunal? And the third question is, everything must be done to make sure that Putin doesn't win the war, but we don't want Putin to win the war of ideas either. And this is why we must organize solidarity among all European citizens faced with this war, and particularly concerning countries outside Europe who were our allies, are still our allies, but unfortunately are still being convinced by Putin. So you have gone around the African countries. What is the situation there? Have you been able to convince them? And if so, how?
Gracias.
Well, thank you, Maria Elena. Well, I haven't been to every single African country, mind you, just a few of them. Some of them have a very clear stand, have taken a very clear stand. They've condemned Russia at the General Assembly of the UN. Others, however, have refrained from doing so. I shall not name any countries, and some others have abstained. And I must say that the Russian story, the Russian narrative, does find an echo in Africa, probably having to do with previous times in history, because we should not forget that the Soviet Union was one of the main pillars of African countries in their fight against apartheid and in anti-colonial struggle. That is simply history, obviously. And this remains still alive in the view of many African countries. And for us, this should be an opportunity to understand the role we must play in the world, and that we should not take it for granted that since reason is on our side, everybody will see the light of reason immediately. Obviously, this accusation of using different standards because we are here. Well, you too, in the past, at other times, were doing similar things. This is still very much there, so we must be stronger diplomatically. We must show better diplomatic arguments, not go around giving lessons to anybody and saying that we're right, but on the contrary, try and conquer the hearts and minds, because Russian propaganda in Africa is extremely powerful. Now, on the creation of an ad hoc tribunal, this is a subject fraught with legal, financial, and practical problems. We should not weaken the very central role that the International Criminal Court should be playing in this area. And this is why we're now focusing our efforts on giving the necessary support to such mechanisms as may turn the ICC into the driving force in this, in order to demand that the justice be done in Ukraine. Obviously, some thinking had been done about an ad hoc tribunal for this situation. It is still open to debate, but let's be realistic here. And we believe that in any case, we should be thinking of a delegated jurisdiction under Ukrainian law, but with some elements from international law. If this were at all possible, obviously, we would be given our support. Now, as regards the situation of children, you're entirely right, totally right. Already before summer, we fully condemned President Putin's decree by which the process was being simplified in order to give Russian nationality to Ukrainians living in Zaporizhia. This affects particularly the Ukrainian children who are not under any paternal care right now and parental care right now in these regions. And we believe that this way of granting nationality is a way of abusing the defenseless situation of many children who unfortunately no longer enjoy the protection of their families. Well, you see, more than 1,000 children have been wounded in Ukraine. I'm speaking here only of the children who have died or who have been wounded, more than 1,000. These are the figures we have, but actually the real figure is probably much higher, many more than these 1,000 children. There's also the risk of violence and even sexual abuse, trafficking, and all the evils associated with being separated from their families and leaving the door wide open to abuse. This is why, obviously, we condemn this attempt to appropriate Ukrainian children taking advantage of the situation of vulnerability.
I have an additional question.
Merci. En ce qui concerne les pays...
Thank you. As regards the African countries, thank you very much, Mr. High Representative, for having indeed met some of these countries. Now, this is the strategy of the global gateway of the European Union right now. This is the medium-term strategy. We congratulate you on this. But in the short term, also action must be taken, because we need to face up to for instance, the issue of the prices of commodities, so that these countries would not be in a situation where they can't meet the expectations of their population. So what is being done as regards the urgent measures that must be taken?
Mr. Borrell.
The Commission has already mobilized 600 million euros to help bring down the prices of basic commodities. We have reinforced all the exports we have been able to bolster from Ukraine through the Black Sea. We've given support to the United Nations for this build that was made possible thanks to the intervention of Turkey as well, and which made it possible to export much more by ship than we could have done by rail. But there's one thing I'd like to draw your attention to, and this is the sheer scale of the problem. When I said that we've raised so many million euros, automatically I would have to divide that by the number of people to whom that assistance is going to be devoted. We must be aware of the fact that we should all really not be very happy. We would even be blushing at the result of this division operation. Hunger in Africa, what is happening there? I've been to the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Mozambique, and I can tell you that the combined action of the climate change bring about droughts and the blockade of the food products that are still in Ukraine. All of this has given rise to a situation which, well, I don't want to be using words that would sound hackneyed, but the situation is indeed dramatic. In the Horn of Africa, there are millions of people who have had to move from their land and who do not have enough food available. Food will be reaching them. For many of them, however, it will be too late, far too late. Blockading the Ukrainian ports will be leading to many lives being lost. We'll be able to save some, but unfortunately there's a deep-seated structural problem, and this is that the climate change, which will be affecting the most vulnerable parts of Africa, will indeed have an impact which we will not be able to avoid. So, consequently, we have to restructure the economic activity of the people there. For centuries, they lived off agriculture and cattle. And they will no longer be able to do so because the climate simply will not allow them to do so. And this is why the European Union must step in. This is where the European Union must live up to its additional commitment. And we will say that in Africa, and we'll see this in Sharm el-Sheikh at the forthcoming climate conference, Africa obviously has very weighty arguments to put forward in order to require further commitment from the European Union.
Thank you very much, colleague Koutsos. Georgios.
Ευχαριστώ κύριε Πρόεδρο και ευχαριστώ και τον Αντιπρόεδρο της Ευρωπαϊκής.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank the Vice President of the Commission for the interest he's shown in all these topics. I have a question I'd like to put to you regarding armament systems. We know that the Ukrainian army has been doing rather well recently. There have been quite a number of surprises along the way, some good, some bad. This war is going to last. Now, are we being consistent in our arms deliveries policy? Is the same method being deployed when adopting 9 billion euros worth of aid, while at the same time lagging behind in actually stumping up the money? And the same applies to arms deliveries. Delays in arms deliveries are far too serious in their impact. So what can you do to speed up the provision of that military assistance to Ukraine? And what can we in the European Parliament do to help them? Then I've another question on Russian arms. We adopted an embargo, but have they managed to get around it?
Mr. Borrell.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. As you all know, for the first time in the history of the European Union, we've been able to use our resources in order to help a country at war. Member states are doing so by themselves, but never had the Union done so as such. And may I remind you, this is not part and parcel of the EU budget. This is not the budget that you have all adopted. This is not the budget of the Union. This is an intergovernmental fund that is being run by the member states directly without any intervention from Parliament, because it does not belong to the budget that you have adopted and on which you are giving full reports. So your intervention as MEPs is limited. However, you can think about the future, indeed. How in the future will we be able to sustain the defense capability of Ukraine? since the war, unfortunately, will not be coming to an end soon, apart from what we're doing with the European Fund, there are the inputs being made by the member states themselves. At times there are delays here. However, I definitely don't want to point a blame a finger at anybody. But very often the delays are due to the fact that countries say one thing but don't actually agree on how to go about it. Lately, we have reached some agreements that will make it possible for this assistance to be made available more quickly. The second thing that you mentioned, very important, whether our action is affecting Russian military capability. And my answer is yes, indeed it does. Because if you look at the inside, the guts of a Russian tank destroyed on a Ukrainian street, you will see there the tremendous amount of electronic components manufactured by European countries in those tanks. I won't give you any names, but you will see so many different brands of high technological businesses in Europe. 45% of Russia's technology depends on European imports, and this has been cut off. 2/3 of all civilian aircraft can no longer fly because the components come from Western countries, and the blockade also makes it impossible for them to get the spare parts they need. So this embargo, which is a peaceful way of acting, is going to have consequences. It's already having very serious consequences indeed. And Russia is not able to overcome the huge military losses it has undergone.
Mr. Kurtzes, do you have an additional question?
Ήθελα να κάνω μια πιο ειδική ερώτηση. Διαβάζω για παράδειγμα στο διεθνή τύπο.
Yes, President. I would like to put a more focused question, if I might. I've read in the international press that North Korea has been providing arms to Russia. Are other countries doing the same? That's a question we need to address. I hope, for example, that China hasn't followed that path of providing military support to Russia. Do you have any information on that, please?
The only thing I can say is that China has always kept a very clear position on this, and this is that it would not give any military assistance to Russia. North Korea, well, North Korea is outside our control, but China, where China is concerned, always, in every single meeting we've had with them, they've been quite clear. They were not planning to provide any military assistance to Russia. If there's any other country doing that, I know not. But where China is concerned, I can assure you what the official position of that country is.
Danke, Mr. Gahler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gahler.
Yes, thank you very much. Fortunately, all of us, or most of us here in the House, agree that it is Ukraine that must win the war and not the fascist regime in Moscow. Now, at short notice, we do need, of course, to sustain the supply of weapons from the West, and we see there are deliveries, especially also from the United States and Britain. If it had been only the Europeans, wouldn't have been enough for Ukraine to survive. Now, we have established a clearinghouse on the EU side, and in parallel now we had the second Rammstein conference where also some commitments were made. My question is, how is that being coordinated? Are you in contact in this regard with Mr. Stoltenberg? And especially the question is also, how can we encourage especially our major member states, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, to deliver more? And also, especially in my German case, to encourage the German government not to deliver something unilaterally, but take the lead in organizing the delivery of tanks that are necessary for Ukraine, together with other nations. Please do it behind the scenes and get the Germans where they should be. Thank you.
Mr. Borrell.
Thank you, Mr. Gahler. Thank you for your encouragement. En el Servicio Europeo de Acción Exterior.
In the European External Action Service, we've set up a clearinghouse unit which receives requests for military assistance from the Ukrainian army and then compares those requests from the offers from the member states to meet those requests. And we establish what each member state is doing off its own bat so as to avoid ending up in a situation where we have too much of one thing and not enough of another. There are 27 of us, so coordination isn't all that easy, but it's been working well, and we've been trying to avoid overlap, not just amongst ourselves, but also with the US, the UK and other allies. Having been in touch with Mr. Ramstein in charge of that unit and the deputy responsible for this issue, Ambassador Charles Fries, I can tell you that the coordination is working well. But above and beyond that, we must make the most of this situation in which Ukraine has launched a counteroffensive and is scoring much greater successes than even we had anticipated. This shows that the strategy that we followed right from the beginning is the right one, and that we must continue to apply it. Now is not the time to weaken. On the contrary, we should be redoubling our efforts at this point. Putin is expecting weak democracies, fragile democracies, to cave in the winter and to cut off their support to Ukraine because it will be cold and the cost of gas will be so high. We need to keep up our support to Ukraine because we're seeing that it is effective. Who would have thought when Putin launched his war that 6 months later the Russian army would have been pushed onto the defensive or actually retreating? Who would have imagined that? It's been possible thanks to the bravery of the Ukrainians in defending their country, but also thanks to the support that we've provided for them. Wars are won with arms, after all. In January, when I visited the Donbas region, the Prime Minister of Ukraine clearly told me, if we're hoping that if Russia attacks us, you will provide us with arms so that we can defend ourselves. And that's what we're doing. I want to take advantage of this platform in the European Parliament to address European citizens and ask them not to weaken their support for Ukraine. Now is not the time to downplay this support. It has been working, so we need to keep it up so that we can reach a situation which will allow us to solve the conflict with respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for what you said, but Mr. Stoltenberg was quite clear. He said it's worse when Ukraine loses than when we have empty arsenals in our member states. So how to get our member states, the big ones especially, to deliver what they have got and not to think that it's better to preserve it for their own purpose. Because I think one thing is clear. Our weapons at home are already directed at Russia. They are the enemy. But if we can make it usable for the Ukrainians and they can reduce the Russian stockpile, then it's also a reduction of the threat towards us. I think it's simply as that. So thank you.
Mr. Borrell.
Una vez más, señor Galler.
Once again, Mr. Gahler, you're right. But my powers are limited. I'm not yet actually a European defence minister who could instruct the armies of Europe to do one thing or another. My role is that of a coordinator, and a coordinator depends on the goodwill of those he's coordinating. That goodwill is there, and we're continuing to apply pressure to all the governments to get them to understand that there is a question of timing here. If there's something you're in a position to do today, it's better to avoid waiting until tomorrow to do it, because a day or a week's difference with winter on the horizon can make the continuity of military operations very difficult. So time makes a vital difference. You've asked me to work on the German government. I can assure you that I'm making approaches to all European governments, and I'm getting from them indications that they clearly will want to keep.
Thank you very much. The next person to put a question is Mr. Piccola.
Representative, 6 months into unjustified and illegal Russian aggression on Ukraine, we are encouraged very much by the resistance and successful counterattack on Ukrainian army. Ukrainians pay the highest price of this war, and they depend on and deserve our support. However, political, economic and social consequences of the war are felt globally. International reactions to Russia's war and its serious violation of international law have displayed some rift in the international community. We note with concern that some third countries have been tempted to listen to Russia's manipulative allegations according to which EU and Western sanctions were responsible for food shortages and famine in third countries. My questions: do you see the need to adapt EU policies promoting multilateralism and a rules-based global order? If so, in what way? And finally, which main challenges for EU strategic communications does Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine impose?
Mr. Borrell.
Una pregunta.
That's a difficult question to provide a succinct, palpable answer to. However, getting down to brass tacks, Russia is trying to sell to the world the idea that it's our sanctions that have prevented food getting through to importing countries, and that it's our sanctions which are pushing up the price of energy. It's our duty, starting with myself, of course, to explain to the world that that's not the case, because European sanctions have no effect whatsoever on the export of food products or fertilizers. They're not affected in any way by our sanctions. There may have been instances of what they call over-compliance in the jargon. That's to say there are some players who don't want to take part in trade even though they were in a position to do so. That is possible. Cases of market avoidance, saying I'm not going to operate on this particular market because it's too complicated, that's also possible. But you're talking there about individual cases. I've sent letters to all the foreign ministers of all countries in Africa asking them to explain to me what specific problems they had encountered with the import of food and fertilizers so that we could help solve the problem. And there have been very few instances indeed. I'm not saying there isn't a problem, but that problem is not one that we have caused. Was it caused by the war? If Russia is saying it's dangerous to navigate through the Black Sea near Crimea, then of course the cost of insurance shoots up. If someone says there's danger in a journey, then insurance companies increase their premiums, and that has an impact on the price of the goods being exported. As for the scale of the multilateral system and our commitments to the developing world, the so-called Global South, there are more and more people who see themselves as part of the Global South. We have to be very much aware of the desire for greater political recognition from the Global South and their desire for us to make a stronger political commitment. There has to be political awareness of this because the multilateral system as it is does not reflect the distribution of power. It reflects the position in 1955. When it comes to recognition of Africa, there isn't a single African country in the G20. a more effective commitment. Just a few days ago, there was a conference in Europe on the consequences of climate change in Africa. And the Africans quite rightly complained that there's virtually no senior European figure taking part. The meeting was being held in Europe. We weren't devoting enough attention to them. Africa is right. The global south is right to say that climate change problems are not ones that they have created, but they are the ones who are going to suffer the direst consequences. So we need to be stronger in our commitment. It's not enough just to shoot out a wonderful figure today. If in the near future it doesn't actually get through to the last cent, and that doesn't always happen.
An additional question?
Thank you for your response. My second question would be a follow-up related to the Russian influence in the Western Balkans and its effect evidently and for the long time has surpassed disinformation campaigns. Are there any new ideas and proposals, possible consequences, be considered in the case of the Western Balkans, in particular related to the countries and stakeholders where Russian influence is the most present, where they are not aligned to our sanctions and the majority of citizens does not support European Union accession and support Russian aggressions on Ukraine instead?
Mr. Borrell?
Que me autocorrija, porque antes...
Perhaps I should correct what I said just now. Earlier on, I said there wasn't a single African country in the G20, but there is. I actually meant to refer to the G7 rather than the G20. I had a colleague, an African foreign minister, with me a few days ago, so please allow me to correct my mistake. You know, so some may be listening and thinking, oh, he's got his facts wrong. You're also right, Honourable Member, in saying that the Balkans are fertile ground for the debate of ideas and for the clash of narratives. There definitely are countries in the Balkans where Russia, and also China, but Russia above all, has huge influence. In certain countries, support for joining the European Union is weak and falling. I'm not going to name names, but if you line up the countries that are candidates for membership and others, and if you categorise them in terms of their support for the European Union, you'll see that there are some in the Balkans that don't have much support for the European Union at all, and Russia has greater influence than us in some of those countries. You can imagine which ones I mean. And this is a result of the extremely slow way we've been dealing with our accession requests. It's completely out of kilter with the political realities of our world. This creates resentment because of frustrated expectations. And in politics, as in nature, it pulls a vacuum. So we need to reiterate our commitment and ensure that our words are followed by deeds. We must start with those countries who are closest to us, since this clash of narratives needs to be backed by contrasting our deeds. It's not enough just to swap speeches. We also need change in what's actually done.
Alexandrov Jordanov.
Уважаеми господин председател, уважаеми господин Борел, новините без...
Honourable President, Mr. Borrell, We have indisputably got good news from Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has launched a liberation offensive. Each victory on the part of Ukraine allows Ukraine to get closer to peace. My question is as follows. Do you fully support the Ukrainian President, Mr. Zelensky, who said that peace negotiations can only be launched after the Russian army has fully retreated from Ukrainian territory, and only after Ukraine has seized full control of its territory? Thank you.
Mr. Borrell?
No sé cuándo.
Well, I'm not sure if and when the peace negotiations should start. They always have to start with a ceasefire. I'm not the man who will be advising the President of Ukraine. He's the one who's facing invasion. For us in the European Union, the sooner negotiations take place, the better. Peace negotiations in a war don't come about just by chance or because of any sort of miracle. They come about when circumstances allow of them, and when the wishes of the aggressor allow it. Up until now, all global leaders who have held talks with Mr. Putin have returned with the same response. He does not envisage ending the war until such time as he has achieved his military goals. And at the moment he doesn't appear to be achieving them. It seems to be that rather than asking President Zelensky about this, he is the attacked party, you should rather be putting this question to the aggressor. Ask him when and how he wants to stop his aggression.
Thank you.
No, imam
Actually, I have an additional follow-up question. Personally, as a diplomat, as a politician, would you approve of peace talks as long as there is even a single Russian soldier on Ukrainian territory? Don't you think that peace talks should only take place when the aggressor is outside the territory of the Ukraine? And also because there are voices in the region and in the Western Balkans of calling off the sanctions, do you think it's acceptable to discuss any issue with the current president of Russia? Don't you think that in view of our future relationship with Russia, we should only talk with a different president of Russia? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the honourable member. In reply to your first question, well, it's not that I'm avoiding replying to it. I just don't think that my views on this are particularly relevant. Whether or not I think there should be negotiations while there's a Russian soldier on Ukrainian soil, what does it matter? My views on that have no importance at all. What matters is what the Ukrainians think. I can't take their place. On the issue of sanctions, well, that is something where I think it's important for us to continue to press the point that sanctions are effective. And we cannot lift them until such time as they have had their effect. They don't have an immediate impact. It's like going on a diet to lose weight and being upset that you haven't lost kilos and kilos after just a couple of weeks or so. Of course, you have to keep on a constant tack. Otherwise, the kilos you've already lost will very easily be put on again. So, should we or should we not be talking to the Russian leader? Well, look, diplomats are trained to talk to everyone. Everyone you need to talk to. And undoubtedly there are certain things that we need to discuss with the current Russian leadership. President Macron talked to President Putin a few days ago about the safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Should we or shouldn't we be discussing safety at that nuclear plant? Of course we should. And who can we talk to? The person who's in charge of the course of events in Russia. There's no one else we can talk to. Of course we have to talk about issues such as that. We're going to have to continue to do so. That's why we have diplomatic channels. There are certain issues that cannot be addressed without active input from the Russian authorities. And the example of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is an obvious one. Of course we can talk to them about how we can provide safety guarantees for that nuclear plant. And of course we talked to Russia via intermediaries under UN auspices to ensure that Ukrainian food produce can be exported.
Thank you very much. Madame Hilde Wartmans.
Ja, dankjewel, meneer.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. A lot of questions have already been put, but I think we are extremely concerned. Europe has clearly shown its teeth in its unity in our reaction to Russia and the Ukrainian crisis. But my question is, how are we going to keep that unity? We all know that we need to extend our list of sanctions. How are you going to tackle this to make sure that we keep the spirit of unanimity so that we can extend the sanctions? And what are we going to do against Russian disinformation? That's extremely problematic. My second question, you're familiar with my position on European defence. If this isn't the time when we take a giant step forward on European defence policy, when on earth will it ever happen? You say you're not a European defence minister. Well, I would have been glad if you were. I wish we had a European foreign and defence minister. When are we going to get away from this coordination, call it whatever what you will? It goes on year after year. We need a European army very quickly. And then on nuclear safety, you say diplomats have to talk. Well, as a citizen, I'm extremely concerned about the safety of nuclear power stations. It was a little vague. Could we have some more concrete details, please?
Mr. Borrell?
Tenemos una hoja de ruta.
We have a roadmap, honourable member. We have our strategic compass. We have to use it. That document wasn't something that we devised to file away in an archive or anything. It's something we need to apply in practice. And as you say, we have a powerful incentive to do so now. Now we've seen the bear extending its claws, and something that had been theoretical up until now is becoming very real. And I do hope this will provide an incentive to the member states to strengthen their defence capacity, and to do so in such a way as will provide a coordinated approach. We're not quite yet at the stage of a European army in the singular, but do let us try to ensure that the European armies in the plural increase their capacities while avoiding overlap and ensuring that there are no gaps. If each member state increases its military capacity without taking any stock of what the others are doing, the final result will be a huge waste of resources.
Of money with European taxpayers. If we want to spend not more but better, it has to be done in a coordinated manner, and that's what we try to do. So let's see if by the end of this year we are able to implement some of the measures of the strategic compass. Let's see if the member states are ready to provide us with the modules to build this rapid reaction force. Let's see if we continue working with the PESCO programs, and if the European Defence Agency provides guidance and people follow this guidance in order to avoid more duplications and avoid more gaps in our military capacities. This is a good occasion, because the Europeans, thank God, we forgot about the war. The war was something that was happening very far away, and now it's happening in our borders. The sense of the dramatic, the sense of the situation in which the citizen has to understand that defense capabilities is not a luxury, the less the better. No, it's no longer the less the better. We need to have capacity to face the challenges of our world, and what's happening in Ukraine is a good example that these challenges are not theoretical but real. And the European Parliament can play an important role in order to explain to the European citizens what it's about. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam.
We don't have the mic yet for the speaker. One last follow-up question, Mr. Borrell. We had a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Committee last night where we discussed an opinion from the Constitutional Affairs Committee regarding how Europe should actually be working now. Now, what I'm about to say may sound a little blunt, but Europe's greatest problem now is how it actually works at the present time. We had the conference on the future of Europe, and there were all these citizens' panels who came out with a huge range of wonderful ideas. So my question to you is this. Do you agree that we should implement these proposals? For example, the quick abolition of the rule on unanimity, a convention, the European army, I'm going to keep going on about that, and lastly, the strengthening of your own role. Let's ensure that we have a true European foreign minister in the future. Thank you.
Mr. Borrell.
It would be strange that they will not be in favor of reinforcing my role and the role of my successors. It would be very strange if my answer would be, no, I don't want to reinforce my role. Certainly I want. And if we could take decisions by qualified majority, it would be much easier. Because more and more, there is not incentive to participate in the debate. Because the unanimity means at the end veto right for everyone. And if you have the veto right and you know that nobody can do anything without you, you don't have an incentive to participate in the debate and to form coalitions in order to get something good for you. You just sit in your corner and wait for them to come and to buy you. Well, to buy you. I mean, to make proposals that you could accept in order to change your position. But if 27 member states do the same thing, it's very difficult that we get a quick answer to urgent problems. So yes, I am very much in favor of having decision-makers procedures which are not based on unanimity. But you know which is the problem? In order to abandon unanimity, we need unanimity.
Danke. Wenn sich alle...
Thank you very much. If everybody sticks to their speaking time, I shall endeavour to include 4 more speakers so that each group has got the possibility to put a question. So, Mr. Mixer.
Thank you, Mr. High Representative. Recent positive news from Ukraine battlefield, in part due to the Western military equipment donations, mostly US, but also European donations. The attrition during wartime obviously is enormous, so the Ukraine continues to need our donations. You mentioned the use of clearinghouse mechanism, you mentioned the use of European Peace Facility. My question is this, or 2 questions actually. What is your very blunt assessment? To what degree are we currently able to satisfy Ukrainian needs so that they could consolidate the gains they've made in the battlefield? And secondly, even short of European defense minister or European army, can we right now do something to move beyond the role of just coordination between the member states and take on a more active role as the European Union when it comes to delivering military aid to Ukraine? Thank you.
Mr. Borrell.
Oui, il faut pas.
We should not minimize the role of the coordinator. And in any case, it is absolutely essential. And it's not just the role of the coordinator that is involved. It's also taking initiatives and making proposals. The coordinator is not just sitting down there somewhere and coordinating what other people do. It's actually very active. At the beginning of the war, we hadn't even thought of the possibility of mobilizing the European Peace Facility. It is we who proposed this. We didn't coordinate other people's requests. We actually put this request on the table ourselves, and I will be putting some concrete requests on the table soon. We're going to move up to the 6th military assistance tranche coming up via the European Peace Facility. So really, my ambitions, my capacities don't really go beyond that, obviously, because I know that in the area of defense, member countries are suffering. Defense is a competence of the states. And I'm not here to try and do something outside the treaties, but on the contrary, to try and use the treaties to the hilt. So I coordinate and I try and implement things. And for the time being, that is as far as I can go, but we're doing it well.
I cannot take an additional question because we are over the time. Please, Mr. Kofod Peter.
Tak for det, formand. Tak for at give mig ordet. Jeg vil gerne følge op på et af de første spørgsmål, der blev stillet i den her runde, der handlede om de afrikanske lande. Fordi som jeg forstod det, så var der lande i
We were talking about Africa earlier. There were some African countries with which, Mr. Borrell, you have not been in contact. However, they have been in contact with Russia. Are you giving support? Are we giving support to countries, to African countries that, in fact, are towing the Russian line? And that, in fact, would be involved one way or the other against the European continent. Shouldn't we have to do something about that type of behavior and defend our own interests, whether it be as regards Russia, as regards Africa? What is your answer to this, Mr. Borrell?
Sí, claro.
Well, yes, of course. Of course, we do have to respond to that type of behavior. But what is this response going to be? We have to be very careful. When we do respond, we shouldn't push some countries further into a position deviating from ours. Next week in New York, we shall have the United Nations Week. And practically all representatives of the countries of the world will be there, and in particular African countries. And we will have to engage in dialogue with them. A dialogue that should not elicit any more reluctance, but on the contrary should lead us down the path of cooperation. I said this morning, and I've said it again. Allow me to insist on this yet again. Africa does have very many reasons to be asking the developed world to take their problems on board. Those problems have become even worse with climate change, with the pandemic, and the impact of the war. The pandemic we didn't cause, obviously not, but the climate change, to a very large extent, we're much more responsible than Africans are. And therefore, we must keep one thing clearly in mind. When we see that we have problems with our forest fires and high temperatures, that's absolutely nothing. It's a great deal, but it's absolutely nothing compared to what African countries are going through in the area of drought or hunger. Their situation is much worse, much more dramatic. So we indeed have to be alive to their problems, and that is the best answer I could give you.
Danke. Mr. Bütikofer. Additional question. We are seeing over the time. I asked you. Please, Mr. Bütikofer.
Thank you, Vice President. High Representative, you emphasized just a few minutes ago that obviously member states have the remit to do defense policy. Still, as European leaders, we also have the responsibility to try coordinating as best we can common efforts to support Ukraine's defense of their own sovereignty and their own borders. In the past, many European leaders have rejected the call from Ukraine to provide modern tanks to help the Ukrainian army to fight more effectively. More recently, rumors have it that the American administration might to be charting a new course. My question to you, High Representative, is can you inform us where that conversation stands at the moment? Thank you.
Mr. Borrell.
No sé a qué discurso.
Well, I don't actually know what particular discussions you're referring to, sir. The only thing I know is what I know, and what I do know is that we shall continue giving our support to Ukraine with our capacities without wavering. Now, the United States will do what they see fit, but we must play our own role here. And we're doing our part. And we should not criticize ourselves because we are doing it. If you look at what the member states have been doing individually and the European Union, we're not very far from the effort undertaken by the United States of America. Our support, in fact, has been key. The support of the United States obviously has also been essential. But what I think that we should be insisting on is that we have done a great deal, and thanks to what we have done so far, we can now see the results in the field, and this military support must be continued. Yesterday, the Ukrainian minister, when I was speaking to him over the phone in order to prepare this debate with you today, he was telling me that they will be continue fighting in order to defend their territorial sovereignty, and in order to make sure that Russia would have to pay for its economic, moral, and political responsibilities in the destruction of Ukraine. For Russia to assume those political, economic, and moral responsibilities in the destruction of Ukraine. And that is the target we must have in continuing our support. This is what he told me, and this is what I'm conveying to you. But in order to do this, we need public opinion everywhere to give support to this.
Mr. Wojciechowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This debate shows that support of the European Union is a very symbolic one. The most support is coming to Ukraine from the member countries. Poland is one of the leading countries which is supporting Ukraine in a political way, military and humanitarian way. Poland serves also as a hub for international support. At the same time, Poland, as I said, which is the leading country in the support, is sanctioned by the European Union. Is penalized by the tribunal. Commission stopped the recovery plan. There are a number of resolutions against Poland, even based on a fake news coming from this House. So my question, Mr. Borrell, would you like to help Ukraine by helping Poland to assist in an effective way Ukraine? So if you like to help Ukraine, lift the sanction, help to lift the sanction imposed on Poland. Thank you.
Mr. Borrell.
When one thing is not really connected with the other. Military assistance to Ukraine is one thing, and complying with European norms or rules is a different thing. And I don't think that there is a choice to be made between the two. Because we're actually doing one thing doesn't necessarily mean we would stop doing the other. And I can't go into this because that's not my role. It's not part of my remit to pass judgment on what Poland is doing vis-a-vis this or that situation. But what I can tell you is that the fact that Poland has been supporting, and it is still supporting a great deal, Ukraine, does not exonerate Poland from complying with its obligations as a member state in other areas.
Noch zwei Redner.
Thank you very much. We've got two more speakers. The next one is Katamil Özlem.
Herr Borrell.
President, Mr. Borrell, you said at the beginning that this war will come to an end sooner or later, and I hope that it ends as quickly as possible, not just because of the skyrocketing prices for people worldwide, but in order that the deaths in Ukraine come to an end. So what's going to happen in the context of getting some kind of ceasefire in Ukraine, discussions for a ceasefire? I haven't seen anybody take any approach towards discussions on a ceasefire. So what is the EU doing except for imposing sanctions and delivering weapons? What is the EU doing for peace? The Secretary of the Security Council of Ukraine said a few days ago that the Ukraine is not going to be satisfied with Donbass or the Crimea or with war reparations, but what they want to do is to totally demilitarize Russia. So what does the EU think of such a strategy? I feel that this is a strategy which is in the wrong direction.
Microphone, please, sir. Microphone.
Thank you. It's okay.
Señora diputada, usted y yo queremos.
Madam, you and I actually are wishing for the same thing. We want the war to come to an end, and we want it to come to an end as quickly as possible. But for me, as for you, there's one very serious concern, and this how the war is going to come to an end. I want it to come to an end very quickly, but I'm indifferent to how that war is brought to an end. As quickly as possible, yes, but not in any way. And that is one thing we must all see quite clearly, because obviously if we stop helping Ukraine, perhaps the war will come to an end sooner. But would you like the war to come to an end in a country dominated by an aggressive power? You don't care about how the Ukrainians will be living after the end of the war? Of course you do. Of course you do. And I'm not quite sure that you don't want Russia to come out victorious from its aggression to Ukraine. So what are we doing indeed to build peace? At the present time, what we're doing is helping Ukraine defend itself from the aggressors. This is what we're doing. And this, I believe, is the necessary step in order to achieve a peace worthy of that name.
Last but not least, Mr. Castaldo.
Thank you very much, dear Chair, dear High Representative. At the G7 summit earlier this month, the leaders of the participating countries agreed to set a price cap for Russian oil export, triggering a strong reaction from the Russian side, with Putin declaring that in case this happens, he would stop exporting oil to Europe. Therefore, dear Josep, I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit further on our possibility to enforce this decision without generating a boomerang effect on our economies and on our citizens. One of the main options brought forward by the analysts is to deny Russia the access to the London insurance market, which covers around 95% of the global oil shipping. Do you think this would be a sufficient deterrent? And is there a consensus among the EU member states to proceed this way? Also, I believe that one of the main objectives of our external action should be to enlarge the number of countries worldwide that would support this initiative in order to consolidate the bloc of liberal democracies opposing this barbaric war. Is there any outreach plan to foster cooperation with our partners, and how is it looking at the current stage? Thank you very much.
Danke, Mr. Borrell.
Las cosas no.
Well, things don't really go that fast. I do have some data that I would like to share with you. I think we've heard over and over again that sanctions are worthless because whatever sanctions we take, Russia still has a lot of revenue coming into the country. Well, the very latest figures on this show that if we look at things between January and August this year, and we compare that to January, August last year, the Russian budget has gone up by 18% less due to the fall in the sales of oil and gas. And the tremendous surplus Russia used to enjoy is actually melting away because over the past few months, income coming from the sale of hydrocarbons has dropped tremendously. 18% drop from January to August. A tremendous drop, therefore, in the Russian budget due to this drop in the sale of hydrocarbons. So far, obviously, Russia was all right because the price was high and therefore lower amounts were being sold, but offset by the higher prices. But the situation has now changed because the sales have gone down so much so that whatever the price, it really is not offsetting the drop. Today, we import 5 times less gas than we used to before the beginning of the war. And let's keep that in mind. Let us be keenly aware of what we've been able to get in a very short lapse of time. When we tell ourselves that we want to rid ourselves of depending on Russian gas, we haven't achieved this yet to the tune of 100%, but 5 times less is a great deal in such a short period of time. So what we must continue doing is more of the same. More of the same. Keep cutting down on the consumption, looking for alternative suppliers, developing renewable sources of energy. That is the only secret to this, really. And when a few months ago from this very rostrum I said that we Europeans had to reduce our heating by 1 degree, which is the equivalent to reducing 7% of consumption, I was told some very kind things. It was indeed covered with niceties. But it wasn't such a stupid idea, was it? Because today we're talking about not just going down 1 degree in heating, but more than that. And we will have to do so because we're going to have to adjust our heating habits if that is the price we have to pay in order to obtain and achieve our energy independence. And we're doing so. And we're on the path to it.
Ich bedanke mich beim Hohen.
Thank you very much. I should like to thank the High Representative, and I should like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your support. We extended the question time for 20 minutes. so that we could take account of the majority in the House and so that each group would have the possibility to put a question. That was the reason for our going over the time. And it was a very interesting question time, I must say. It was a very good format. I think it's shown its worth. So on that note, I bring the question time to an end and come to the next item on the agenda, a statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy on the situation in the Strait of Taiwan. Vice President, it is my pleasure to give you the floor once again for your comments on this issue.